just joining, we'll explain that we are broadcasting live today with permission of NIADA to our streaming channels, which include LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook group, the BHPH Boardroom, BHPH Success. We're specific to our Buy Here, Pay Here segment. And also, I think I left out LinkedIn. So
LinkedIn. And Michelle's here too. Yeah,
Michelle is here too. So I'm Jim Rhoads. I'm the founder of the Octane Group. More recently, I'm known as Michelle's husband and co-host of the BHPH Morning Show. So we kicked that off in May, and we have just had so much fun with that. And we're just really finding that there's an opportunity and a need to be able to speak to people about this stuff that is Buy Here, Pay Here. Of course, those of you who tune in, you hear us talk a lot about principles and kind of what we call a white hat way to do business. Lots of people out there striving to do business the white hat way. We're just trying to shine a spotlight on that. We know there are people out there doing it, and so we're just trying to, make sure people know about that. Again, Michelle and I are the owners of the Octane Group. We're a coaching and implementation company. I've done 22 years of Buy Here, Pay Here consulting. It's now taken me to more than half of the states in the country, calling on finance companies and Buy Here, Pay Here dealerships. And so that's the nature of our work. But today I want to share with you that I'm going to move through some of these slides pretty quickly. You're going to have access to the slide deck, and you can always reach out to me. We'll make sure you know how to contact us. So if questions come up, then you'll have a chance to, oh, look at that. We got GR Moore speaking to us inside the event. Cool. So the idea then is I'm going to move through some of the slides quickly because there's just a couple of key messages that if I only have the opportunity to send you home with a couple of takeaways, there's a couple of things I want to make sure we get to. And so I'm going to move quickly through some of this information that you guys see all the time. But we do a lot of metrics work, data work with our clients have over the years. And so, but it's almost all coming from the DMS. So that means we're only really seeing operational numbers, inventory, sales, collections, receivables. We see that. We don't see the expense side of the business with most of our clients. And so there's often this disconnect. Like they can see really good operational numbers, maybe see how their portfolio is performing, look at the collection stuff, which is what we do. But then when it comes time to making it all tie together, that becomes the trick. So we're ready, Michelle. We can start the presentation. We good on your end?
Yep.
Nice. Okay, so KPIs for me, we're going to move quickly through some inventory numbers, sales turns. We like breakout. That's something many of you in 20 groups have heard talked about. When I first started measuring breakout, we used to talk about it in weeks. Now we talk about it in months, right? So some of us might be talking about that in years, but it's gotten much longer in the time I've been in the business. The gross to cash and deal ratio is another number I'd like to look at. I call that the reward to risk ratio. And then collection efficiency, that's one of the ones where I'm going to spend a good amount of time. That's something I've been tracking for dealers for 20 plus years, and we know the importance of that one. And I want to make sure we understand the opportunity that really comes from tracking that collection efficiency number. Principal conversion rates, that's kind of my terminology for what many of you might be looking at collateral recovery rate or some variation of these things. We'll talk about that specifically when we get to principal conversion. Positive cash flow is something we want to look at. When I look at positive cash flow, I'm looking at it from an operational standpoint, and I'll explain that when we get to that part. And then reconciling receivables to cash is something that we really emphasize, and that's part of where Amanda comes in. When we start doing that stuff, now we start to add not just an opportunity to identify leakage in our business, which could be theft, it could be mismanagement, but we need to identify that leakage and make sure we can account for all those dollars. And so that, for me, is an operational thing that we need to look at. And then obviously that translates right into the financials and the balance sheet. Okay, Michelle. So now let's talk first about that inventory turn rate. When we look at turn rate, I find that people, can look at these things from all different kind of angles. But for me, I would recommend, I typically look at it in units. I'm showing you in dollars from an accounting standpoint. If we're going to look at that, we're going to look at that more in dollars. But on inventory turn, I'm really talking about the unit count. So you can look at that on frontline inventory only, or you can look at that in terms of the entire inventory. The reason I like to look at it from a frontline basis is if I know that if I start the month with 40 cars available for sale on the lot and we sell 60 cars out of that 40 car inventory in a month, then that to me is a really important number for us to know. And if I'm looking at the sales performance, yes, of course, you've got all these dollars potentially in cars that are tied up behind the building, but I'm really when I'm looking at that number, I'm looking at primarily from an an economy number from a number of how efficient are we at moving through our frontline inventory, because that's a measurement of our performance in the sales department, right? How well are we doing at moving that inventory through? So regardless of how many other dollars we might have in cars in the back, it's interesting to know, and it's another number we can measure. But I definitely recommend looking at the number in terms of how many cars we start the month with, how many cars we sell, and obviously, you know, on a given month, that number might be up or down, seasonality, whatever. But look at the rolling average basis and say, okay, how many units are we carrying? And because we have dealers in our client base that are turning inventory at a tremendous clip. And when I meet new dealers, they often don't know that that's possible. Like, you know, you'll hear people starting in buy here, pay here, and they'll ask, well, how many cars do I need? If I want to sell 30 cars a month, don't I need 60 in inventory? Well, that's typically true in independent retail. That's sometimes the kind of ratio you might expect in a franchise segment. But in our buy here, pay here segment, we see dealers turning their inventory much faster than that. So just know that that's possible. And so we have dealers turning their inventory 2 and 3 times per month. So now you're talking about 20 plus times annually, at least on the retail inventory, whatever's available for sale, the rate at which they move through inventory. Because again, I think that's an indication of our sales efficiency, right? That's a question of how well are we moving through, and how appealing is the inventory that we do have on the lot, regardless of how many dollars we might have tied up on the back line. Okay, we can move on. So breakout, that's a pretty easy thing to understand. We're just looking at cash and deal. We all understand that, you know, cash and deal is sometimes called risk or exposure, and we're looking at that number. So if our cash and deal is, you know, $6,000 after down payment, then we divide that by the contractual payment, and that tells us approximately how many months that we are carrying some exposure. Now, some might say it's an arbitrary number, doesn't make a hill of beans on the financials, right? It's not a number you would look at. So it's but from an operational standpoint and from a risk management standpoint, we're trying to understand how many months of payments will we need to collect before we actually see some profit. Especially because the IRS wants to tax us on day one, right? As soon as we sell the car, they want to. So we got to know what's that curve look like? What kind of time frame? So again, you can see the math on that. Just take the equivalent monthly payments, and that number is going to vary. Some of you ask, where should that number be? We see it, you know, all over the spectrum. Everybody's risk tolerance differs. Business models differ. Obviously, I'm coming from a school of I want to see that money recovered as quickly as possible. So, you know, the answer for me is always going to be shortest possible time. You know, that's going to be the answer we're looking for, is I want to recover that basis, that cash and deal, just as quickly as we possibly can. And now we're obviously into profit at that point. So let's go ahead, at least I shouldn't say that. I should be more careful. We're into cash flow, you know, relative to our cost in the car, right? So, let's talk about gross to cash and deal. I mentioned I like to call that the reward to risk ratio. So the reason I like to look at this number, many of us are used to looking, especially if you come out of the retail business, you might look at either what's called gross margin or rate of return. Rate of return being profit on the sale relative to the cost in the car. So, or we'd look at profit in the sale as a percentage of the selling price. That would be more like gross margin. But I like to look beyond that and look at the gross profit compared. So if this gentleman's buying a car for $5,000 and selling it for $10 and getting $1,000 down, they both have the same markup. Or if Lowell over here's got buying a car for $5 and selling it for $10, but he's getting $3,000 down, then we can see that the profit relative to the risk in the contract is different. I think most of us know which dealership we'd rather own, right? If that's the situation. So it's about how much risk are we taking relative to the potential reward. And look, for our conversation here today, when we look at this, we're really just looking at the front end numbers. We're looking at the sales at the time. We understand there's interest income and other factors to consider there, but we also understand that's real risk, right? That's real cash exposure relative to, we're not going to be able to change the selling price. So that profit in the contract is the profit in the contract. So that number's not going to change. So I like to look at that from a reward to risk ratio. So we can go ahead, Michelle. So again, I'm going to try to move quickly through this because I wanted to talk mostly about collection efficiency today. And this is a number, I figured it out last year, I think. I've been looking at this number for some dealer somewhere for over 1,000 weeks in my career. This is a number that we look at weekly. Okay. So You capture the number each week. We like to see you grab your projection report for the upcoming 7-day cycle. In our case, with our clients, we grab the number on a Sunday and we look at the upcoming Monday through Sunday. Now, the part that's really important to understand about this is we want to, if your software will take you there, we would like to know the contractual amount that's due. So that means, if Dave's got a contract with me and the payment amount is $100 a week, then irrespective of whether David is paid ahead or behind, I would like to see a report that tells me that contract has a contractual amount due for this period of $100. That's the number I would like to see it measure against. Okay. So we know there are some systems that provide that. So it's a number that we think is especially important. But when you look at that in terms of a filtered number, what we're trying to do is we then come back and say, okay, we know what we were contractually expected to collect from David, in this case, $100. And then you come back and say, okay, how much did we actually collect? So if David paid the regular payment of $100, then we know we're 100% with respect to that account. Obviously, we're going to look at this on an aggregate basis, all accounts. How much were they contractually expected to bring the entire portfolio? Why? Because we own this multi-million-dollar portfolio, perhaps. It's expected to produce a certain amount of income for us. It's supposed to produce a certain amount of cash for us each week or each month, right? Again, we look at this one weekly. So now we come back and say, okay, we know what the portfolio was supposed to generate. What did it actually generate? And now we filter that by large payments. Because if you get a large CPI check or some insurance check comes in, it's wonderful that we collected it. It does go in the bank deposit. It just doesn't belong in our filtered collection efficiency number, because that's not money we expected. So we filter out that unexpected money. We traditionally have done $800. I would say with payments creeping up the way that they have, you might want to look at $1,000 number for a filter, and just filter out anything over $1,000 and see where that leaves you. All the years of history with this number tells me when you go back and measure that number and you filter that stuff out, if you can actually get to a true projected contractual number, we'd like to see that number run 93% or better. So I really need to take a minute and make sure everybody thinks about that. Why would I say these are poor credit consumers? Come on, Jim, 93%. So we just know from history, if we're running below 93%, that is an indicator of a problem to me. And it's something that we would want to identify, because there are several reasons. And the reason this is so important to us from an operational standpoint is if we're running below 93% on that number, let's first ask ourselves, where's the 7% going, Daryl? We know that, we've got a deficiency there. Where's that number going? Well, it's easy enough to understand if David's contract that was $100 a week, if David didn't pay, we went about 3 or 4 or 5 weeks and it's still spitting it out every week on the contractual because it's an active account. Now we repossess the account. It ultimately gets charged off. It's easy enough to understand over those 5 or 6 weeks, that money that we expected, according to the projection report, didn't make it in the bank. That's an easy one to understand that we're deficient. So I would just ask, where do we think there's really only 2 places the money goes: charge-offs and non-performing accounts. Do we know what the other one is? It's going to be deferrals. It's going to be money that we expected to collect. It was the report spit it out that we were supposed to collect that money this week. We chose to modify the contract or otherwise go in and do every software calls it something different, but we're going to defer the due date. We're going to push the payments out. And while you can say, I'm still going to collect that payment, Jim, I'm going to collect it later. That's true. But for this period of time we're measuring, it's not in the bank. It didn't make it in the bank, right? So that's deficiency. And that's why the alarm starts to go off for me at about 93%. If we're dropping below that, we need to go look at that. And the other reason this is important, and the reason I wanted Amanda to join me in terms of talking about tying receivables to cash, we know from experience that this number, plus some of the numbers you're going to hear her talk about, are numbers that are our best indicators for leakage in our business. Now, I use that terminology generally. When I talk about leakage, if we have missing money, because let's say I'm running 89%, so I've got some unexplained deficiency there. When I get inside that number, I would want to be able to say, okay, where's that money going? Why am I not getting that money in the bank? And experience says it could be theft, right? Or it could be simple mismanagement. Because if we've given somebody authority in the software to do deferrals, and that gets out of control, and we don't really have a way to keep an eye on that, we're happy because we run the delinquency report on Monday, it looks fine, right? we might be saying, hey, our bank account's running a little bit short. We don't quite understand why. But if we would look at that number, if we had that number on collection efficiency, yes, on any given week, that number might be low. Next week, it might be high. It'll cycle up and down. Biweekly payments and all this stuff, it'll be up and down. So we typically look at that number across a 10-week rolling average. And we like that because that pulls in biweeklies, monthly payments. If you look at about 10 weeks, you're capturing a pretty wide range. And now we just like to see that number run clean. So if you think about, okay, so in that same example that I talked about with David's payment, if he didn't make the payment, well, now that shouldn't go on for too long, right? If we have non-performing contracts, the longer we have them sit in our portfolio and we don't deal with that, then that means contractually we're expecting a payment on that account. Contractually, it's still active. And we're looking at a portfolio, we're looking at a balance sheet that says, wow, our receivables are strong. We have plenty of dollars in our portfolio and our balance sheet. But in reality, a percentage of those are not performing. What should we do? We should deal with that. We should repossess the car, recondition it, remarket, whatever, and charge off the account. Now that's how we run clean, because those contracts that quit performing, they don't stay in there as a non-performing contract for very long. Amanda knows the price that we can pay if we carry a lot of non-performing contracts in our balance sheet. And if there's a lender in the picture, that can get messy real quick. So we don't like to see non-performing contracts, whether there's a lender in the picture or not. We want to see dealers have confidence that whatever they're seeing on their balance sheet, whatever you're seeing for receivables, that's a good number. Those are performing contracts. Okay. So that's why we think this indicator of 7% is an important one to be aware of. So we can move ahead there. We're going to also try to leave room for questions. And if you have questions, I hope she's got the answers. I mean, I don't have anything for it. So here's what that looks like graphically. 93% is the green line there. And this is an actual client. You can see this from 21 to September of 22. We just grabbed an example. That dealer's running very efficient. And you might say to me, gosh, Jim, 100, 101%. It's a very, very clean, very efficient portfolio. And they're very much on top of and they have a very, consistent process for taking care of charge-offs. So, it's on a regular interval, and now you're looking at a very clean portfolio. Okay. So now we get to the ones principal conversion rates. Now these numbers are the ones that I talked about that you might see this expressed as collateral recovery rate, which Amanda will talk about a little bit. I'm really just simply saying, I want to measure, and what you're seeing graphically here is I want to see if you open the month with a certain amount of principal in your portfolio, pick the number, whatever that looks like. Now, at the close of the month, let's say, Daryl, for your number, you started a certain number for principal balance in your entire active portfolio at the start of October. Now you come back in October and you say, okay, we collected this much principal. That would be the green line. Collected this much principal divided by the opening principal balance. That's the green line. Now the red line would be charged off, gross charge off. Whatever the account balance was, principal balance at the time we charged off, it quit performing. So this doesn't factor in anything you recovered in terms of the ACV. This is just looking at what was the gross principal balance of the accounts that we charged off. So that's why I call it conversion rate, because to me, this is the rate at which our portfolio is converting to cash. Some of you will jump ahead and say, well, what about the interest income? We are collecting the interest income. Yeah, that's important. And that's obviously part of how our business model works. I'm simply saying we should also measure the rate at which we convert our principal to cash, the rate at which we charge off our principal. Look at how those numbers compare. And then just say, okay, so you'll say, well, but because we collect a lot of interest, our principal would be lower. Well, that may be true. If you're in one of the states in the Southeast, interest is up here, then your principal as a percentage of what you collect and P&I would be a lower number. But we still want to see, when I asked the question, I said, I don't think, well, if I ask you definitely want to collect more principal than you charge off, right? So it's like you want to see some gap in those numbers. And that's why we like to see that and just track those numbers. It's a real simple thing. And just a pretty good, quick indicator of portfolio health. And what you're seeing, you see up there at the top, that's a 6-month rolling average. So all that really does is just it smooths out the lines a little bit. And it's more easy to see the trends. So that's what we're seeing there. You can go ahead, Michelle. Operational cash flow. So this, I didn't explain when we started into here that I actually, since the time that Amanda and I put this session together, had a chance to have a conversation with one of our clients, and it just kind of affirmed that these things that we talk about are there's just not great solutions currently in our industry. We're working on them. We're trying to provide dealers better solutions to get this information. But when I talk about cash flow, and I wish I had charted it for you, but if I'm working with a new client, I will, they're just starting their business and we're working on forecasting, I will show them, okay, when we start selling paper, we're going to have some notes, and they're going to start to obviously generate some car payments. You'd see that chart, you'd expect to see that line start to grow. Well, I'd like to see that number first exceed overhead. How much is my incoming cash? And typically when I'm looking at incoming cash, how much of the down payments that I collect, how much of the payments that I collect from customers, P&I. Obviously, as a portfolio grows, we would expect that incoming money from car payments to increase. Even if our sales volume is staying the same and our down payments are staying about the same, we would look at that number. How is that money tracking on the income compared to what's going out in terms of overhead? So if I'm a brand new dealer, I would like to look at that number first. And so we always help our dealers that are coming from, if you're coming from a retail background, then it's hard to adjust to this buy here, pay here thing. When we just kind of do the math for them, so it looks like, based on your expected overhead and the expected car payment, expected down payment, we would need about 83 contracts as an example. We would need 83 contracts to be covering, paying their regular payments, to be covering our overhead. Now, how many contracts do we need to cover overhead plus inventory replacement? And we would recommend looking at that on a monthly basis, but also on a rolling average basis. So I put both on the thing. If you go in there and say, okay, our gross inflow in the month of October was this, our overhead was here, our cost of replacing inventory, what we spent buying cars in the month of October was this, and then our 6-month rolling average for inventory, because obviously inventory numbers will be up and down, right? And so if you look at a 6-month rolling average, our gross inflow relative to those two numbers is a number that I would want to see monthly. It's one of the first numbers I'd want to see. How is our cash flow? Because that's the difference between our bank balance going up or down, And so how's that affecting? Are we still in negative growth mode? And many of us have been going to these conferences for years, and we'll meet these dealers that have these multi-million-dollar portfolios, but they're at the conference doing what? Shopping for capital. Why? Because their business is still going negative. They're still going negative. They're still feeding the monster, right? They're still going negative on cash. So I just ask my clients when they start, let's talk about just trying to get cash positive in a single location. What we do after that, we can decide after that. But I would just say, we open a store. Let's talk about trying to get cash positive on that first store. Let's make a plan for that and try to get us. So operationally, when I talk about cash flow, now Amanda said you're forgetting about income tax. I'm actually not forgetting about it. I just don't talk about it every month because I'm really just focused on the operation of the business. I'm aware that that's another number that we need to climb to, so that we're also covering our overhead and the cost of inventory and the cost of our income tax, right? So there's all these other taxes to think about, but I'm just saying that's operationally, that's really what I'm looking for. And a quick analogy, and I know we need to get it to Amanda here, but I would say that I recently started talking about this in the context of a bathtub. In your own business, if you start a brand new business, if you think about a bathtub, you're going to have the bathtub drain open. You're going to put a bunch of cash in this bathtub to start this business, but because the drain is open, that's your overhead, right? That money's going out the drain every month, whether we're selling cars or not, right? So you put this money in, this investment, this initial investment. And so that money, I'm saying, is draining out, right, the entire time. So now, how do we ever get it up to a level where, if you think about having a hole in the side of the bathtub, maybe it's 2/3 of the way up. Now, if we can ever get our cash flow built up to the point where we're bringing in enough cash to cover those things that I talked about, now we would have a chance to have money come out the side of the bathtub and maybe go back in our pocket, is really the kind of the analogy that I'm trying to draw. But we just have to recognize that drain is open all the time. There's always, because the money you write to the local utility company, that money's not coming back, right? The money you spend investing in a contract for a buy here, pay here customer, that money may or may not come back. We hope it comes back most of the time, but we know the money that we pay in overhead, utilities, that money's not coming back. Payroll, not coming back. So it's a question of, how does that work in terms of our operation? How much cash is actually flowing out the bottom? What'll it take to get to the place where some cash can start to come back to us? I hope that's what we're mostly in it for, because I always talk about, our balance sheet is cool. I mean, it's nice to see the big number, but we can't really spend that. We can maybe borrow against it. We maybe sell the paper, but the reality is that's not money in our bank. That's not money we can spend. So we're just trying to help dealers get to a place where they think about this at least and understand where they're at relative to cash flow. Go ahead. Now, reconciling receivables to cash. This is the part that I asked Amanda to kind of pick up on this, because we see it, and working with dealers, we just recognize there's an opportunity here. And this is the other big one. It's the simplest way I know to say it is, well, if you in your portfolio started October at a certain number, and you know that you sold a certain amount of cars, and that would have added contracts to the principal balance in your portfolio, then it went down by some number, and you closed the month with a certain number. Well, shouldn't we really be able to account for all that? Started here, added contracts, receivables went down. Is it in the bank? If it's not, shouldn't we know where it is? So this is really the point. So whatever exercise you go through, we understand that's not going to be all cash. It would be charge-offs. We need to know that. It could be write-downs. We need to know that. So this is where I'm saying we need to be able to identify that so that we can say, because again, this is where you start to stop leakage in your business. You start to plug holes that we call the gaping holes. There are vulnerabilities that we have. And if we don't make time to reconcile that and identify where the money is going, then this is where we leave ourselves vulnerable. We need to be able to identify that. And some, like I say, some of it will be simple charge-offs, it'll be write-downs, but we should know. We should know where those went. And so this is about accounting for all the cash, and again, being able to make sure we can reconcile that. So Amanda's going to take you through some reconciliation methods. You got your microphone on already? Amanda Butler-Sanchez.
Yay.
Hello, everybody. Thank y'all for coming out, and thank you, Jim. Thanks, Michelle. So what I'm going to talk about is, talking about the reconciliation of cash. This is something that I do every time I work on a set of financial statements. It is important to know what's happening with your portfolio, how much did it change, and very specifically why. So I just want to go through some of the things that I look at whenever I'm looking at a dealer's financial statements. Okay. And we'll go to the next one too.
You want one more?
Yep. Okay. So yeah, the very first thing I'm looking at is your portfolio growth or liquidation. Did you increase? Did you decrease? Did you maintain? From a general standpoint, and I think Jim mentioned, your receivables, that's your biggest asset. That is where your money is. That is the heart and soul of your business, is that portfolio. And so when I'm looking to see, did it increase? Did it decrease? The bigger question is why. Why did it increase? Why did it decrease? Generally speaking, a healthy portfolio is a growing portfolio. That does not mean that a growing portfolio is a healthy portfolio. Let's be clear about that. But generally, a healthy portfolio is a growing portfolio, or at least maintaining. Your portfolio is dropping and it's not intentional. That's usually a sign of some kind of trouble. And so that's the very first thing I'm looking at. Hey, how did we change period over period over period? And then the next step is looking at why. And I go through the process that Jim mentioned as I say, okay, here's where we started. All right. We started with this many accounts by dollar value and by number of accounts. Here's where we started. This is what we originated. This is what we've collected in principal. This is what we've charged off. Well, that better get me pretty close to where we end up, right? And if it doesn't, that's something to be inspected and looked at. We'll go to the next slide, Michelle. And on that note, collateral recovery rate. This is what Jim calls the principal conversion rate. This is also something that I look at, and I'm looking at it for a little bit different of a reason. It's more important if you're with a lender, if you have a line of credit, to look at your collateral recovery rate. As Jim mentioned, what it is we want to see the percentage of your portfolio's liquidation that is coming from collections. So what that means is we've already talked about all the different changes in your portfolio: originations, collections, charge-offs. With this, I'm specifically looking at only the things that reduce your portfolio. So your principal collections, your principal charge-offs. And what I want to know is for every dollar that your portfolio decreased, what percentage of that was due to collections? What percentage of that was due to charge-offs? So I want to know what are we actually converting to cash, as Jim mentioned. This is especially important if you have a line of credit. And if you look at the name of the ratio, that kind of tells you why. This is called collateral recovery rate. It is literally what your lender, the rate that they can recover their collateral, your portfolio, in the event of default. So that's very specifically collateral recovery rate, meaning, hey, if you know what hits the fan and we've got to get out of this, what can we recover? Next slide, Michelle. And the next thing that I'm looking at is your debt to assets ratio. A lot of you guys will know this as leverage, leverage ratio. And this is just looking at your debts relative to your assets, right? And very specifically, again, very important when you have a lender, is I'm looking at the amount owed on your line of credit divided by your principal receivables. And when you're looking at this, if you think about what that means, this is saying, okay, we've got this portfolio, $5 million portfolio. This is what we owe the bank. Well, let's think about that collateral recovery rate. The collateral recovery rate of our $5 million portfolio, what hits the fan, what can we get back? Well, you better hope that amount is greater than what you're leveraged, right? Does that make sense? You're all following me? So you want your collateral recovery rate to be greater than your leverage ratio. That way, something hits the fan, you have to cash out, you turn around, pay your bank off, and you walk away with a little something in your pocket. And so what this shows from a big picture standpoint is the percentage of your assets that's really funded by creditors as opposed to your own, operations. Okay, debt to equity. So this is very similar to debt to assets, but this is showing the percentage of your operations that's financed by creditors. So a less popular way to say this, and it sounds a little painful, is this is the part of your company that the bank owns, as opposed to what you own. And that is important to look at just from an overall health of the company. Now, Jim mentioned how looking at the balance sheet, you can't see the cash, and that's true. From a financial statement aspect, a lot of you guys, y'all think a lot about your income statement. What's your bottom line? What are you going to be taxed on? What's your sales volume? In terms of financial health, I'm mostly looking at the balance sheet. And it's very much a, balance sheet is king, is what I like to say in terms of this. But from an operational standpoint, cash is king. Cash flow is king. And if there's one thing that you need to know from trying to reconcile your cash flow to your business, the easy way to do it is your books look really good when you've got no cash, and they look really bad when you got a lot of cash. It's just the exact opposite of what you expect. And so we go to the next one. Okay, gross profit margin ratio. Jim mentioned a little bit about this, and the next slide is going to be about the net profit margin. This is basically, I'm saying, I look at every single line item on your income statement as a percentage of your revenue. This data is useless if you just look at it as it is, but when you can take it and look at industry benchmarks, when you can benchmark against yourself, period over period over period, that's really where the power comes into that. So with your gross profit margin, gross profit is just your sales price minus your cost of vehicles sold minus your repo losses. So that's basically like, what does your business do, right? You sell cars, you finance people. That's going to be your gross profit. So we want to see what part of your gross profit, it's your profitability from your main revenue source. So from your main source of business, buying, selling. It does not include your overhead. The next slide is going to be your net. And that's when we're going to include overhead as well when we're looking at that margin. It's a next slide. And so here's where we're also going to include your overhead expense. And so I think a way to distinguish gross from net, a lot of you guys do pack fees, right? To try to account for all of the other costs that aren't directly, cannot be directly allocated to the vehicle, but are costs that you incur. So it's kind of like, it's almost like looking at the pack fee. We're going to include the overhead expenses and try to see how much does it cost us to make $1, right? What does it cost us to make $1? And so those are primarily the things that I'm looking at. In terms of, sorry, y'all, I'm nervous. I get nervous.
You're doing great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And so net profit margin, that is something I'm looking at. And again, that information is a lot of this information from a financial statement standpoint. This is not the equivalent of your cash flow. This does not touch on your operations. One thing Jim and I talked about, and how many of you guys have a fully integrated DMS where you're entering all of your overhead into your DMS as well, where your DMS knows how much rent you pay. They know what you pay your CPA, which isn't really overhead, y'all, but they know your payroll, right? Does anybody have that? Only some of the more sophisticated, the highest level of sophistication DMS have that. And buy here, pay here, we don't really have that. That's not something you do. And if you think about where is my cash crossing with my DMS, there's only two places. The first is your collections, right? Hopefully what's showing as a collection is showing up as cash, as Jim mentioned. You'll see that crossover between your bank statement and your DMS. And then the second place is going to be with your inventory and the recon that goes into it. Yes.
What's the benchmark for net profit margin?
So this really depends on if you have a lender, and it really depends year over year. So the last couple years, collections have been very, very strong. Buy here, pay here has been great. People net, once it's all said and done, have been netting about an 8% the last couple years. Prior to that, you're normally at like a 2 to 3%. And I will say, yes. I'm sorry, say that. So what that is that you're using your gross revenue as the numerator. So that's your sales, your financing, your total revenue. Okay. And then your net profit, what's going to be that's the denominator. Your numerator is going to be your bottom line. Like your after all expenses, after it's all said and done, this is what you made. So most people, if you take your gross revenue times an 8%, that should be what you're taking home. Yes, and actually that's a good point, because in the benchmarks you do add back the owner's salary. You don't reduce that and consider it as part of the overhead. So that's a good point. 4%.
CarMax is around 4%. What do you believe 2023 will bring?
Put me on the spot here, huh? So, the reality is I don't know. It's such a different time. Of course, what we all hope is going to happen. We know that things are going to get a little bit worse before they get better, but we do hope that they get better, right? Tough question to answer. I think that, 2020 and 2021 were record years for the industry. I've seen some of that come back a little bit in 2022. I've seen this, the pedal come up a little bit on that. And I imagine it's going to do the same thing for 2023. But hopefully we'll start to see, some of that coming back in full force.
In the books, if you exclude the last 2 or 3 years, would it be accurate to see?
Yes.
2 to 3% is the
at
average.
least in the past. And of course, if you've been in this industry long enough, you know that it's cyclical, right? We've got our good years and we've got our bad years. And sometimes we've got a lot of bad years in a row and then a couple good years in a row. But generally speaking, if we're looking at like the last 10 years, then it's a 2 to 3%. And of course, it's different for those who don't have, there's also another 2 to 3% going to your lender typically. So if you're self-funded, you're going to have a little bit of a bigger margin. Yeah. Without doing anything. Yeah, perhaps.
What's the benchmark for owner salary and percentage?
So I actually I don't have a benchmark for owner salary as a percentage, because that's more of a, the way that these companies are structured for tax purposes is as an S corporation. S corporation, you're required to pay officer wages. I have some people who don't pay themselves enough in officer wages. And I have some people who pay themselves too much in officer wages. And it really doesn't, it doesn't relate. It doesn't correlate with your sales. It really is more so of a, hey, this is the cash we have, and this is the tax advice we've been given. Yes.
Does total revenue and
So sales tax is not revenue, and it's also not an expense. So it's just a pass through. So the answer is no. What it includes is just your pure sales price on your vehicles that have been sold, and then any interest income that you've collected. Do you have any other questions?
CRR. What's a good benchmark?
So
for
that's
that?
also going to be all over the place, because it's really going to depend on your specific model. But I see people with, 70, 75. Again, if you think about somebody who's going to, sell a lower end vehicle and repossess it and recycle that repossession 5 times, their number is going to be a little bit different than somebody who sells a higher end vehicle and shoots to have, lower charge offs. So that really just depends. I will say that when you're working with a lender, they will use that CRR to kind of determine what your advance rate should be. Because again, they want to be able to recover their collateral enough to satisfy that debt. And so I know that a lot of them are they want to see about an 85% of that CRR. And so most of them are lending to you at 60%, 55% of principal. I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, but the lender wants to make sure that their butts are covered in the event that the, sky drops out. And then they want to leave a little bit of wiggle room there too. And so for a lot of people, that looks like a, 70%, 75. Some people have 80. And again, it really just depends on your specific model.
I would say we just have a few minutes left. If we have any more questions, we're happy to take those. And again, I think for Amanda and myself, we'll share the microphone here so our audience at home can hear. But I would say that the main thing that we wanted to have a chance to talk about today, I believe, is just this idea that, when we look at all these operational numbers, looking at all these numbers out of our DMS, we would like to work together, and we would invite you guys to help us achieve those things, to make sure that we're able to help dealers better connect their operational numbers to their financial numbers, because we just know that's really needed. And we're going to sometimes a lot of effort to put together operational numbers. Of course, we have to do financials. And I always jokingly say, and I owned a business myself with a finance company years ago. It's like the financials tell us, at least the calculations for the P&L tell us how much we owe the IRS. It doesn't always tell us a lot about how our business is performing. That's right. So it's like, that's why it's important for us to connect both, because we also need to be able to look at our financials and make some determination about what should we know. Jonathan, if you're looking at those financials back in Texas, what are you going to see? I mean, what can you determine from looking at your P&L and balance sheet that is going to help you make a better decision about how to manage your business next month? And so we're trying to work together in ways that help us create exactly that, so that we've got good optional numbers, good portfolio performance numbers, and they intersect nicely into what you're going to see on your financials. So that's all part of what we're trying to make sure we accomplish. Any other questions? He's got all the answers over here.
Got one back there.
Yeah. So my question would be, how do the best dealers gather these numbers?
How could the dealers gather these numbers? How do you come up with the numbers? How do you produce?
Depends on the DMS, of course, and our experience. In a lot of systems, that would depend on whether we have somebody on our team that's good with Microsoft Excel or some other, because so many of these, in order to really get to some of these numbers, the quickest way to get there would be to push the data into Excel and manage it over there. Some of them have a dashboard, you know, that we can create that might give you some of this, but most of what you saw here, we're kind of having to manage that ourselves. We're having to create that operationally by pushing the data and then working with it. You know, with some of our clients, we have over the years done performance reporting. We're kind of moving away from more of that, more educating dealers on how to do it themselves. So we're happy to help. You can come and talk to us, and we're happy to help you. Depending on your DMS, the answer might vary in terms of how you get there.
I would add to that, and it's actually a really great question, and it does highlight one of the bigger issues, at least that I see in this industry, which is that, yes, it does depend on your DMS, but even different dealers use the same DMS differently. And so there is a lack of standardization on a lot of these things. And so that's something else that we're kind of trying to work towards, to kind of help standardize everything, that everybody has things done the same way, so we can truly compare an apples to apples. And any of you guys here that are in the 20 groups or DPG, I mean, you guys know, you do your darndest to put your numbers together and compare, but often it's really not apples to apples, and it's specifically things like that. You know, we talk about collateral recovery rate, for instance. That calculation generally is going to include your repo ACV. Well, what are you using to value that? What are you using? Is it all the same? Probably not.
And when do you do your charge off? Like, do you sell the car and then you do the charge off, or do you charge off and assign a value and then the car gets sold? Like, there's just differences in approaches, and it affects, even like she says, even on the same DMS, that process can vary and affects how you would do these calculations.
Right.
Other questions? Wrap up. Thank you so much for your attention. I think there's an opportunity to do a survey on the section. We hope to make
There's supposed to be some kind of survey QR code, but it's not there. So sorry, it's, yeah.